My name is Thomas McAllister. I live in Saskatchewan, one of the most farmed regions in Canada. Our farm here has been our family's livelihood for 3 generations. I am 47 years old and I have never traveled far from this farm in my life, but I have never longed to see anywhere else. Here everything has a simple order. The seeds are planted, the harvest is done, and the land gives meaning. My wife, Martha, works wonders in the kitchen, and my children, Emily and Jack, help as much as we can with the farm chores. Our dog Max is the soul of this farm, roaming the fields and keeping an eye on everything. One of the most constant rituals of life on this place is Max waking me up in the morning by barking on the porch. But last week this rhythm was broken. I didn't know that everything would change that day. In the morning, when I took my coffee and went out on the porch, I noticed something unusual in one corner of the field. I saw a strange, symmetrical flatness forming in the middle of the field. At first I thought it was something caused by the wind, maybe a herd of animals had passed by. But when I looked closer, I realized that this was no natural phenomenon. In one part of the field, the crops were perfectly lying down. There were circles. Not just one circle, but several and intertwined. Within the circles were smaller patterns, intricate shapes, almost man-made. Stranger still, the crops lying on the ground hadn't been broken, the stalks only seemed to have been carefully bent. Max was following me, but when we reached the edge of the field he suddenly stopped and backed away. He growled, tucked his tail between his legs and walked away. At that moment, I got goosebumps. Max had never behaved in such a frightened way in his life. The seeds were still intact, but the soil had a strange smell of burning. This must have happened in just a few hours, because the day before everything was normal in the field. When I told Martha about it, she said, "Don't worry too much, Thomas." But I couldn't stop seeing these strange circles in the middle of the field. I couldn't sleep that night, even the silence from the field was disturbing. Max was used to sleeping on the porch, but that night he clawed at the door to get into the house. When I woke up in the morning, I found out that these circles were not limited to our field. When I talked to other farmers nearby, they said that similar shapes had appeared in their fields too. But no one wanted to talk about it. Most of them dismissed it by saying, the government is involved, or maybe it's a prank by the neighbor kids. But it was clear that none of us thought it was a joke. Soon after, officials came to our field. 2 men, dressed in black suits, said they wanted to inspect the field. They introduced themselves as government officials. Without even saying their names, they walked into the field and began to inspect it with strange equipment in their hands. I started to object, but they shushed me by saying, "You must not give any information to the press." This didn't seem right to me. My field was the breadwinner of my family, and now these men were inspecting it without telling us anything about what was happening on our own land. As I watched them, I felt even more strongly that these circles were no ordinary natural phenomenon. Something inside me told me that this was something completely different. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the field, I wondered how and why these circles had formed. Maybe it was a message, but to whom? Why is it here? Throughout the night I looked up at the stars in the sky, searching for an answer, but all I found was silence. It was a few days before I noticed the hoops in my field. When the authorities arrived, they did their job and left, but they never called again or gave any explanation for their discovery. Instead, they asked my neighbors and me to keep our mouths shut. They told us not to talk to the press and left the field with a look of intimidation. But they couldn't stop the whispers spreading around the farm. Later that afternoon, I went into town to buy some groceries, and I saw Joe Cartwright in front of the store. Joe was an old man who owned a farm a few miles from me. He liked to talk about many things, but this time he had a strange look on his face. "Thomas," he said, his voice shaky, almost a whisper, "I need to tell you something." I wasn't sure whether to take Joe seriously or not, but it was clear that the circles in the fields were making him uneasy too. To calm him down, we went to the cafe next to the market for some coffee, where he told me about something he had seen that night. It was the night the circles were drawn, Joe said, his hands clasped tightly around his mug. Everything was normal. It was after midnight. At some point my dog started barking. I went outside and looked, but I couldn't see anything, but there was still an uneasiness in the air. So I got on my tractor and went to the edge of the field. Joe took a deep breath, his eyes seeming far away. That's when I saw something in the sky, 2 blue lights. They were shaped like balls, but believe me, Thomas, they didn't look like anything. They were flying silently, right over the field. They swirled and swirled for a while, then at the same time they shot up into the sky and disappeared. I was speechless at Joe's words. I didn't know what to say. I thought he might have misunderstood what he had seen or imagined it, but I didn't say anything. I wanted to encourage him to talk more. Well, did you notice anything else? I asked. Yes, Joe said, blinking his eyes. After the lights disappeared, I noticed that part of my field had the same circles. But Thomas, these lights, there was something about them. I don't know how to describe it, but there was a feeling. As if their gaze was watching me. At that moment I felt that Joe's story was somehow connected to the circles in my field, but I still had no concrete evidence. Just strange circles and a man's expression of fear. When I got home that night, I told Martha what Joe had said. She rolled her eyes. Joe was already a bit of a crazy man, she said. But I didn't think so. I saw the fear in Joe's eyes. The mystery of the circles was far from solved and the unrest in the village was growing. The fields with the circles now seemed to carry an ominous air. People stopped going out at night. Even Max stayed away from the field where he always liked to wander. The next day, while I was doing my chores on the farm, a black car stopped at the edge of the field. 2 men got out. They were different from the officials who had inspected the field before. They had nothing official on them, but they were definitely foreigners. They were holding some maps and equipment. They looked silently across the field for a few minutes before coming to me. Mr. McAllister, one of them said in a thin, cold voice. Have you seen or heard anything in this area? After a moment's hesitation, I said, No, I haven't seen or heard anything. The men exchanged a brief glance, then nodded and got into their car and drove off. But as they were leaving, they turned and looked at me one last time. It was as if to say, if you know something, don't hide it. As the days passed, the effect of the circles on me increased. Every morning, as I watched the field, I realized that I felt something in the middle of those circles, a feeling I couldn't explain, both awe and deep fear. These circles were more than an ordinary event, I was sure of that. But at the same time, I was haunted by the thought that this could threaten me and my family. The government, the neighbors, what Joe had seen. Where it all came together, the truth was hidden behind a dark fog. After that night when Joe told me what he had seen, things got even stranger. It was as if an invisible force had taken hold of everyone in the town. People avoided talking about the circles, and the uneasy atmosphere on our farms intensified. Especially after the days of those 2 strangers coming and going on my farm. Early the next morning I went out and walked to where the hoops were. Max was not with me, he no longer went near that part of the field. When I got there, I noticed something new around the area where the circles had been. There was a thin, burnt-looking mark on the grass. It radiated outward from the area where the circles had been drawn, as if something had rubbed against the ground. These scorch marks stretched from my field to Joe's farm. There was a connection between all this, but I couldn't understand what it was. That day, Joe came to me again. But this time he was more agitated. He had dark circles under his eyes and tiredness in his voice. Thomas, I haven't been able to sleep for the last few nights, he said. I've been hearing strange noises in the quiet of the night, like someone wandering the fields. I tried to calm Joe down, but in the meantime a thought settled in my head. The blue lights Joe had described. That the circles had formed that very night. What if he really saw something? I couldn't get that thought out of my head. I couldn't sleep that night. After tossing and turning in bed, I dressed quietly, grabbed my flashlight and walked over to where the circles were. It was cold, but deep down I wanted to know what was making me so uneasy. When I arrived at my field, I stood at the edge of the hoops and listened to the surroundings. Silence, and then, a faint humming in the wind. At first I wondered if it was my imagination, but the sound became clearer and clearer. It sounded like it was coming from under the ground. Max suddenly started barking. I scanned the perimeter with my flashlight, but I couldn't see anything. When Max calmed down, I took another look at the center of the circles. Again, that inexplicable feeling came over me. A few days later, the authorities came to my field again. But this time there were more of them. A larger team was walking around the field, taking measurements. Their instruments were making strange noises. One of them approached me and said coldly, "Mr. McAllister, this field is now a research site. No trespassing will be allowed," he said coldly. "This is my field," I protested, but he didn't even look at me. They put a fence around me and let me out. From that day on, I was forbidden to approach my field. My access to the area with the hoops was completely cut off. When I spoke to Joe, I found out that the same was true for his farm. The authorities had blockaded the area. They were not giving anyone an explanation, just keeping silent. The people in the town seemed to accept the situation. No one was asking questions, no one was objecting. This silence was driving me crazy. After a while, local journalists wanted to report on the incident, but they were not informed either. A few weeks passed since the events. The hoops were still in place, but I felt as if the field no longer belonged to me. Whenever I passed near the fence, that inexplicable feeling of unease returned. One evening, I went for a walk to the mountains on the other side of the field. From there, all the circles were clearly visible. That's when I realized it. The patterns of the circles seemed to contain a message. But what was this message? Finding the answer to this question became an obsession for me. Joe moved out of town after a while. "I can't stay here anymore," he said. He left with a look in his eyes that carried the weight of what he had been through. I chose to stay on my farm, and the hoops remained in place, their mystery intact. The authorities left quietly after a while, but they did not remove the fence. That field remained a mystery forever. To this day, when I walk past that field, I still feel that something is watching me. The circles did not disappear, but I never had the courage to find the truth behind them. Perhaps some secrets should be left unsolved. June 15th, 2008. That night will forever be etched in my memory. I was working the night shift in Wiltshire County, an area already famous for its mysterious crop formations. We received several calls about unusual lights and activity near Silbury Hill, but none of us were prepared for what we'd encounter. Around 2:15 a.m., a call came through from a local farmer who reported seeing strange, pulsating lights hovering over his wheat field. As the on-duty officer in the area, I was dispatched to investigate. The summer night was unusually clear, and the ancient chalk hills loomed in the darkness as I drove down the narrow country roads. What made this particular call different was that we had multiple witnesses. 3 separate motorists on the A4 highway had also reported seeing the lights, and one had even managed to capture some footage on their mobile phone. This wasn't going to be another routine check of teenage pranksters or local vandals. Something about the urgency in the witnesses' voices told me this was different. As I pulled up to the edge of Andrew's farm, my police car's headlights illuminated something that made me question everything I'd been trained for. There, in the middle of the pristine wheat field, was a perfectly formed pattern of geometric shapes that seemed to radiate outward from a central point. The wheat was laid down with surgical precision, and even in the dim light, I could see that this was no ordinary vandalism. The strangest part? The formation was still being created. The wheat was actually moving, bending in ways that defied explanation. I immediately called for backup and began documenting everything I could see. The air had an unusual static quality to it, and my radio started experiencing interference, something that had never happened in this area before. This was just the beginning of what would become one of the most well-documented crop circle events in recent British history, and I was standing right in the middle of it. What happened in the next few hours would become part of the official police records of Wiltshire County. As per protocol, I began taking photographs with my department-issued camera while waiting for backup. The formation was approximately 150 feet in diameter, with intricate geometric patterns that seemed impossibly precise. At 2:45 a.m., Sergeant Thompson arrived with 2 other officers and our forensics team. The first thing we noticed was that our electronic equipment was behaving erratically. Brand new batteries in our torches were draining rapidly, and mobile phones were showing unusual interference patterns. Dr. Nancy Parker, our forensics expert, noted that her electromagnetic field meter was showing readings far above normal background levels. We established a perimeter around the formation and began our systematic documentation. The wheat stalks were bent at precise 90-degree angles, not broken as would be expected if they were manually flattened. Even more peculiar were the nodes of the wheat stems. They appeared to be elongated and burst on one side, something our agricultural expert would later say could only happen under intense heat or pressure. Several soil samples were collected, and we found small deposits of magnetized iron particles in the soil, completely unusual for this area. The farmer, Mr. Andrews, confirmed that these particles weren't from any farming equipment or fertilizers he'd used. The events at Andrews' farm didn't end with daybreak. In fact, what followed over the next few weeks would become one of the most extensively documented crop circle investigations in British history. By 6 a.m. that morning, the site had attracted considerable attention. The BBC had already dispatched a news team, and researchers from the University of Southampton's Department of Environmental Sciences had arrived to conduct their own investigations. Dr. William Levengood, a prominent biophysicist known for his crop circle research, flew in from America specifically to analyze our findings. The laboratory results that came back over the following days only deepened the mystery. The soil analysis revealed several anomalies that our forensics team couldn't explain. The crystalline structure of the soil within the formation showed signs of brief exposure to intense heat, somewhere in the range of 1,500 to 2,000 degrees Celsius. Yet, remarkably, none of the plants were burned. The wheat stems themselves showed evidence of rapid cellular expansion, as if they'd been exposed to microwave radiation. The most compelling evidence came from two unexpected sources. First, the RAF, Royal Air Force, released their radar data for that night, showing an unidentified aerial phenomenon in the vicinity between 2:10 a.m. and 2:25 a.m. The object, or objects, moved in ways that defied conventional aircraft capabilities, making instant 90-degree turns without deceleration. Secondly, a local astronomer, Dr. Patricia Hughes, provided us with spectrographic data from her observatory just 3 miles from the site. Her equipment had recorded unusual electromagnetic frequencies during the exact time frame of our incident. These frequencies, when analyzed, didn't match any known terrestrial sources. The case attracted international attention. Within days, we had visits from researchers from several countries. The Japanese NHK Broadcasting Corporation sent a documentary team, and researchers from Russia's Aerospace Institute requested access to our findings. The formation itself became known as the Wiltshire Node due to its unique geometric properties that seemed to reference ancient mathematical principles. What made this case stand out from other crop circle reports was the sheer volume of scientific data we collected. The ground temperature anomalies persisted for weeks after the event, and independent laboratories in 3 countries confirmed the unusual properties of the soil and plant samples. The magnetometer readings showed residual patterns that formed a precise geometric grid extending well beyond the visible formation. Perhaps most intriguingly, several months later, satellite imagery revealed that the formation was part of a larger pattern. When viewed from above, similar formations that had appeared across southern England that summer formed an intricate geometric sequence, with our site at the exact mathematical center. As the lead officer on the case, I was called to testify before a closed parliamentary committee on unusual phenomena. While I can't disclose everything from those sessions, I can say that this case led to the establishment of a new protocol for investigating and documenting similar phenomena across the UK. Today, 15 years later, the Andrews Farm formation remains one of the most thoroughly documented cases in the official records. The soil samples are still preserved in the National Archive, and researchers continue to study the data we collected that night. The case remains officially classified as unexplained phenomena, but those of us who were there know we witnessed something that challenged everything we thought we knew about our world. Multiple academic papers have been published analyzing various aspects of the case, and it's now included in the training materials for police officers dealing with unusual phenomena in rural areas. While many crop circles have been proven to be human-made art, the Wiltshire Node stands apart, supported by a wealth of scientific data and multiple credible witnesses. As I approach retirement from the force, this case remains the most significant of my career. It taught me that as law enforcement officers, we must approach every case with an open mind while maintaining our professional skepticism and rigorous documentation standards. The truth, I've learned, is often more complex than we initially assume. What happened that summer night in Wiltshire remains unexplained, but the evidence we gathered has contributed significantly to our understanding of these phenomena. Sometimes, the most important answers lead to even more important questions. What made this case particularly credible was the thermal imaging footage from our police helicopter that arrived at 3:20 a.m. The footage showed residual heat patterns in the formation that couldn't be explained by conventional means. The temperature difference between the affected and unaffected crops was nearly 12 degrees Celsius. We interviewed the 3 motorists who had witnessed the lights. Their statements, recorded separately, were remarkably consistent. Each described seeing 3 bright, white lights moving in a triangular formation before descending toward the field. One witness, Sarah Mitchell, a local science teacher, had managed to capture 42 seconds of video on her phone, though the quality was poor due to the darkness and distance. By dawn, we had accumulated enough evidence to fill 3 evidence boxes, but we were no closer to explaining what we had witnessed. This wasn't like any other crop circle investigation I'd been involved with. This one had multiple credible witnesses, physical evidence, and most importantly, official documentation.